army spreading like a stain through continental Europe. Thus, when Ike gives Stalin the green light to attack Berlin on his own, Churchill is furious. A flurry of telegrams between the British and the American brass ensue, but nothing changes in Eisenhower's plan. Soviet and Western commanders must coordinate their attacks to prevent Hitler from regrouping his forces. Politics will have to wait. Ike's caution may be inspired by the boogeyman of national redoubt, the presumed Nazi suicide strategy. Allied intelligence fears that Hitler's intent is to move from open combat to guerrilla tactics, possibly extending the war for months. Distant concerns about the Red Army are overshadowed by the specter of a fanatical force withdrawn indefinitely into the Bavarian Alps. Alpine redoubt may be nothing more than a myth, but Eisenhower refuses to roll the dice on a risky drive to Berlin. Better to keep Germany in a state of chaos, isolate her forces. No longer in doubt. It is the only sane response to his situation. But as his Führer demands a fight to the death and his troops scramble in disorder, the question has become, how? First April 1945, Okinawa. It's Easter Sunday, and the troops of the 1st and 6th Marines and the 7th and 96th Divisions get their pre-invasion meal in large enough quantity that journalist Ernie Pyle refers to the spread as fattening us for the kill. Gorged on holiday breakfast, they climb aboard amphibious tractors, Amtraks, and roar into the surf off the northern beaches of Okinawa. Knifing through the waves, they bypass the submerged coral reef, dynamited by Navy frogmen only days earlier to permit safe passage. The Amtraks are covered from offshore by the booming guns of 10 battleships and 9 heavy cruisers. The Fifth Fleet has been pounding the island for 6 days, double the bombardment at Iwo Jima. Off the southern shore, on the opposite side of the island, landing craft carrying elements of the 2nd Marines knife across the water in similar fashion. Here, however, they simply draw near the beach at the hamlet of Minnetonka, then break away and head back to their host vessels, This part of the invasion is merely a diversion intended to keep the Japanese guessing. A month earlier, Minatoga would probably have been the site of the real landings, but April weather favors the northern side of the island. Any defenders watching the beach at Hagushi witnessed the grandeur of an 8-mile-wide line of landing craft bearing down on its sands. Rocket boats augment the offshore shelling. Amtraks hit the shore, spewing forth their human cargo, heavily armed and spoiling for a fight. They charge across the beach, taking refuge at the base of the seawall, scramble over the top, and encounter nothing. Though liberally pocked with craters, the terrain of this part of Okinawa still bears more resemblance to the American Midwest than a Pacific battlefield. Massing troops and supplies on the beach, the invaders push forward through flat patches of vegetables. In the distance, stands of evergreens, oak trees, and small hardy palm trees are nearly devoid of opposition. Only sporadic mortar fire serves to remind the GIs and leathernecks that Okinawa is still Japanese property. Field medics and surgeons sit idly, awaiting an influx of wounded that does not come. Oddly, it is the diversionary force that takes the first American casualties at Okinawa. A kamikaze attack on the transport Hinsdale kills 8 Marines off the south side of the island, while back to the north, the real invasion proceeds like clockwork. The 7th Division achieves its initial objective right on schedule, securing the Kadena airfield on the southeastern edge of the beachhead. To the north, the 6th Marines quickly follow suit by seizing the undefended Yontan airfield. So uneventful is the takeover that during the afternoon, a Mitsubishi Zero lands on the airstrip, apparently unaware of its change of ownership. The ground force pushes inland, gobbling up territory to the tune of 5,000 yards the first day. Goats and other livestock present the greatest obstacles as the Americans branch off to the north, east, and south. Offshore, General Simon Bolivar Buckner observes the landing from the command ship El Dorado. Buckner could hardly have imagined that his charges would encounter more civilian locals than Japanese troops on this first day of action, but that is exactly what has happened. The feeling of cautious relief works its way up the chain to Mission Commander Vice Admiral Kelly Turner. Turner radios the Allied command. I may be crazy, but it looks like the Japanese have quit the war, at least in this sector. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is less euphoric at home base, radios back, delete all after crazy. 60,000 troops oblivious to the repartee at the command level busily set up command and communication posts in preparation for the next day's push. The common refrain among the infantrymen is one of relief at having lived long enough to see nightfall. As the Americans dig in, the evening winds give the mission's code name Operation Iceberg unintended meaning as well. Okinawa is far north of the jungle islands on which the Allies have become accustomed to fighting, and the night is going to be a cold one. For the moment, however, there is much to be thankful for. The first day of the Okinawa invasion passes with only 28 deaths, making it a happy Easter for most. Now they can only hope that on this April Fool's Day, the joke is not on them. Panzer III kept the company. Versatile, tanks have modernized an old role in warfare, becoming the steely steeds of the cavalry, the new workhorses of war. April 12, 1945, Warm Springs, Georgia. The world mourns the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who suffered a cerebral hemorrhage while relaxing with friends at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. A casualty of war, of service to his country. The president was 63. From all over the globe, the reaction is one of disbelief, of sorrow as deeply felt as that for a friend or family member. GIs in the field weep openly, yet resolutely go about their job of winning the war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is overpowered by a sense of deep and irreparable loss, as if, he says, he had been struck a physical blow. Joseph Stalin is deeply distressed, wondering what the future holds for the Soviet Union's relationship with the United States. Sorrow knows no boundaries. From the staunchest Democrat to the most avowed Republican, the field hand to the businessman, young and old alike, in small towns and thriving metropolises, all grieve FDR's passing. As the funeral train bears Roosevelt's body from a sleepy little southern town to a nation's capital bursting at the seams from wartime inhabitants, hundreds of thousands of mourners line the tracks to pay their last respects. For more than 12 years, President Roosevelt has been there for the American people. He has assured them that, really, they have nothing to fear. He has never let them down through some of the darkest days the nation has known. It is almost inconceivable that there can be a United States without President Roosevelt. High school students don't remember the United States even having another president. But now it does. Harry S. Truman, not so long ago a senator from Missouri, now is president. In the 3 short months between Roosevelt's inauguration and his death, the president never took Truman into his confidence. Now Mr. Truman has the weight of the world upon his shoulders. Can he bear it? The president is dead. The world will miss his sparkling smile, his iridescent personality, his inner elan. It will miss the man who, although born to the American aristocracy, fought for the little man. The man who brought power and prestige back to the presidency, who led his country through the Great Depression, rallied it for World War, and escorted it into a position of world power. The man who laid the foundation for post-war world peace. Across the nation, towns are quiet. Businesses closed. The nation sits in stunned silence. Roosevelt is gone. Mark Clark's 15th Army Group on the Forgotten Front. British, Polish, French, and Americans are joined by sepoys, Gurkhas, and Maoris from the British Commonwealth countries of India, Nepal, and New Zealand. In addition, reinforcements have also arrived from African American, Brazilian, and Nisi or Japanese American units. Along with the manpower, the Allies in Italy have also gained some valuable equipment previously denied them. They've received Sherman tanks known as kangaroos that can carry infantry, as well as amphibious DD tanks and tracked fantail landing vehicles, both of which will be useful on Lake Kamakio and in the many areas suffering spring flooding. Clark's armored units also have improved Churchill and Sherman tanks that carry heavier guns, flamethrowing tanks, tank dozers, bridge-building equipment, and masses of ammunition round out the resupply. Allied air support is much improved as well, as more and more heavy bomber squadrons have been released to Italy. In recent weeks, they have been pounding German supply routes, wrecking roads, bridges, and railway yards. Meanwhile, new German commander Heinrich von Fiedinghoff faces a difficult task. His troops are spread thinly across a 130-mile front, and aides have suggested pulling back to better defensive positions. Fiedinghoff knows such a withdrawal is out of the question. His half-demented Führer has given unequivocal orders that he must hold every inch of northern Italy or face serious consequences back in Berlin. Adding to Fiedinghoff's woes is a laughable shortage of fuel. His troops are reduced to using mules and horses to move much of their equipment. If they need to move quickly to fill a break in their lines or mount a rapid defense, they're out of luck. In the early evening, Allied infantry crosses the Seine River while the Germans still have their heads down. Within minutes, the flamethrowers are engulfing Nazi positions. At first, the Germans are too stunned and terrified to offer without difficulty. The first two companies of Kiwis are across the Santerno a few hours later. Meanwhile, the U.S. forces to the west are supposed to commence their offensive on 12 April. But they are forced to wait because of fog and poor flying conditions. But this is a small setback. The overall Allied offensive is well on its way towards the Argenta Gap, where they will have the shortest run to the Po River and total victory. April 1945, Okinawa. The enlisted men knew it was too good to be true. The non-coms knew it was too good to be true. Even the brass knew it was too good to be true. That knowledge provides no comfort to the men of the 96th Division, who engaged the enemy on 2 April, discovering the defenses that Allied reconnaissance had been unable to identify through southern Okinawa's thick cloud cover. Japanese Commander General Mitsuru Ushijima has erected his first line of defense 5 miles south of the American landing beaches, at a line of jagged ridges that define the lower fourth of the island. As on Iwo Jima and Luzon, the servants of the rising sun fight from fortified bunkers fed from a maze of tunnels that keep them out of the American sight, but in no way out of mind. The Allied ground forces push into the Japanese defenses stretched across the narrow island. Their supply capabilities depend on holding the 3 main roads on the island, one running along each coast and the third down the center. To the west is the 96th Division. To the east is the 7th Division. In the distance is Shuri Castle, the heart of the enemy's fortifications. For the Allies, all roads lead to Shuri. The Marine divisions on Okinawa have it much easier, at least for the moment. Charged with the capture of the territory north of the landing zone, General Roy Geiger's Marines discover what the GIs already know. The vast majority of the resistance is located to the south, which means that for most of the Leathernecks, the speed of their forced march is more challenging than the token resistance. The Marines' rapid advance tests the resources of the engineer units, who busily erect portable bridges or, where the passes are narrow, create an earthen span with bulldozers. Virtually every bridge on the island has been destroyed. The engineers are constantly on the move. Meanwhile, the 96th Division pushes slowly down the western side of the island, its advance slowed both by the opposing forces and the craggy terrain, dotted with crevices that form natural tank traps. They have no sooner left behind the vegetable gardens that formed their landing point than they have encountered the vanguard of Tokyo's warriors. With dozens of vantage points from which to fire upon the Americans, Ushijima's men negate the superior firepower of their attackers. American armor, in particular, suffers at the hands of skilled enemy gunners. Army Commander General John Hodge responds by ordering World War I-style frontal assaults up the forbidding ridges. Unlike previous campaigns, the Japanese are patient and determined. Ushijima's Chief of Staff, General Isamu Cho, lobbies for the infamous Banzai Charge. The senior general, however, has learned from bitter experience and is resolved to wear the Yankees down. He hopes to impose enough attrition on his adversaries to bring a quick end to the battle. Offshore, the Western Brain Trust looks upon the situation disappointed but unsurprised. It is now apparent that they are not going to secure their first chunk of Japanese real estate without incurring significant losses. This development troubles Ground Commander General Simon Buckner, who is already concerned for his supply lines and struggling to keep the Allies fully armed. Frequently running short of grenades and satchel charges to root out the dug-in enemy, Buckner's GIs improvised by slamming the heads of mortar shells against rocks to release their firing mechanisms and lobbing the shells over the craggy ridges. This innovative twist on the expression long bomb lets Uncle Sam's forces stretch their resources and keeps the Japanese on the defensive. However, the Empire still has a trick or two up its sleeve. Just after dawn on 7 April, the last of Hirohito's battleships, the Yamato, cruises into tracking range of the Yankees, 250 miles north of Okinawa. The Yamato is the world's largest battleship, plated from end to end with 16-inch thick armor and armed with 9 18-inch guns. Its mission is to draw off Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier group and their fighter escort, opening a path for Japan's remaining kamikazes. The Yamato carries enough fuel only to reach Okinawa. Mitcher counters the huge gunboat with a swarm of Helldiver bombers and Avenger torpedo planes, more than 350 in all. Under rainy skies, they torment the dreadnought, finally sinking it. Most of the battleship's destroyer escort is similarly dispatched. A bomber strike on the Navy carrier Hancock is the only significant Japanese accomplishment of the day. For the ground troops on the island, the failure of the kamikazes is one less thing to worry about, if in fact they have time to consider it at all. Their work has just begun in earnest, and to a man, they know the worst is yet to come. Adolf Hitler promised the Germans a glorious future when he rose to power and of the Versailles Peace Agreement began production of military material. The German economy rebounded, but that was not enough for the Führer. Through the strength of the Nazi Party, he began promulgating the policies of anti-Semitism, Aryan superiority, and the need for living space, which he intended to gain by seizing nearby territories. Hitler prepared the home front for war as carefully as he prepared the military, and he began with the children. Consolidating all German clubs for young people into the Hitler Youth Program, boys and girls ages 10 to 18 years were thoroughly indoctrinated with the Nazi ideology. Through this organization and in school, young people learned about German greatness. They camped, played military-style games, competed in contests that challenged both physical and mental fitness, and gradually imbibed the more insidious Nazi teachings against Jews and other undesirables that threatened German racial purity. Hitler not only molded the minds of a generation, he established a police force had in the stores. The first food crisis hit when even the normally abundant potato crop failed. Although many women took over farming jobs, there were not enough workers to harvest the potatoes before they were frozen in the ground. By early 1942, both British and American bombers began appearing with more regularity over cities in the Reich. Lübeck was the first city to go up in flames due to saturation bombing. Air raids have become the norm for most urban Germans as the frequency and ferocity of the attacks has steadily increased. After the tremendous loss at Stalingrad in 1943, the German people began to see defeat as a very real possibility. Joseph Goebbels worked the German propaganda machine overtime, attempting to quell the tide of rising fear. For his part, Hitler began to intimate that the Reich's citizens would be to blame if the war effort failed, because they did not show enough loyalty and sacrifice. The government has been actively recruiting women for work in the factories since 1941, but the initiative has been largely unsuccessful. Germany's women have been schooled well in Nazi doctrine that urged children, church, and kitchen as the only proper feminine spheres of activity. When the government began conscripting women for the workforce in 1943, they still resisted, taking advantage of every exemption open to them, especially that of becoming pregnant. Children, too, have been subject to the pull of the state. The Hitler Youth Organization volunteered 6 million of its members aged 10 to 15 years old. Even so, the burden of production has fallen on a sizable force of foreign forced labor from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and the slave labor of imprisoned Jews. With every available male sent to the front, women, children, and the elderly have been recruited for quasi-military jobs, including anti-aircraft duty. Operating searchlights, detecting planes, and manning the guns are hazardous tasks, sometimes undertaken by civilian women and children as young as 11 or 12 years old. With Russian troops advancing from the east and GIs and Tommies making inroads into Western Germany, the fatherland citizens have inherited the wrecked dream of their beloved Führer. Germans haunt their ruined cities like ghostly fugitives, or litter the roads in ragtag remnants fleeing the Soviet scourge. When they pick through the rubble of their lives, what will they find of Hitler's grand schemes? Perhaps the shattered landscape provides the only possible recompense for promises built on a foundation of unbounded arrogance and unimaginable hatred. Gasoline, but on indigenous fuels. Grass, trees, vines to be found alongside construction sites. Back at the garage, grind ahead relentlessly in their drive to round up and destroy what's left of the German army in a triangle near the top of the boot. And they are beginning to tighten the noose. The Nazis are pinned against the Adriatic Sea and can only hold their ground, surrender, or withdraw to the north. With the shadows of the Alps and civilians they encounter where they are. All gone, is the excited reply. The Germans are all gone. and pilfered artwork, the dogfaces discover evidence of pure evil. Arranged in neat piles are gold fillings and eyeglasses, the grim dividends of genocide. Discovery of this ill-gotten booty is just another feather in Patton's cap. His accomplishments are piling up, and the press has again made him a star at the end of his glorious war. Yet, he is now, to some extent, a victim of his own success. As the curtain begins to close on the European theater, Patton has completely overrun southern Germany and left its borders. The slave-driving commander who pushed his army to superhuman feats will soon run out of territory to conquer, enemies to kill, and rules to break. Eisenhower has made it clear there will be no American attack on Berlin and no transgressions of the Soviet occupation zone. After several thrilling weeks of uninterrupted triumph, all Patton has to look forward to is peace. Okinawa, the medics serving the 96th Division probably know better than anyone the extent of the difficulties the GIs face along the rough expanse of Kakazu Ridge. They have had their hands full with casualties since the Yanks reached this landmark. The otherwise unassuming 1,000-yard stretch of coral spanning half the island's width at the top of its southern promontory has been fashioned by the Japanese and their local conscripts into a petrified death trap. Firing on nearly invisible targets, the frustrated Americans dodge a harrowing crossfire of machine guns and heavy mortars. The men of the 96th remain pinned down like olive drab butterflies, a still life from which neither advance nor retreat is an easy option. The GIs absorb losses but manage to inflict as many or more upon their tormentors. Impervious even to offshore bombardment from the USS Colorado, Hirohito's helpers are hopeless but by no means hapless. Resigned to the fact of their death on this forsaken outpost hundreds of miles from home, they put up a determined fight to inflict as many casualties as possible on U.S. troops. The initial American assault on Kakazu on 9 April fails dismally. Lacking armor support because of a deep gorge in front of the ridge that makes tank movement impossible, the 96th storms the enemy in an early morning raid that withers in the face of repeated Japanese counterstrikes. The seesaw battle ends with neither side able to gain ground. More than 300 casualties provide a stark tribute to the effectiveness of the island defenses. By late afternoon, it is clear that the Americans must develop a new approach. As the troops lick their wounds, their commanders confer. Their new plan is as elegant in its simplicity as it is unwieldy in its execution. Whereas the previous day's assault was conducted as a surprise attack, the renewed battle is engaged with artillery blazing and reinforcements close behind the lead elements of the 96th. Again, the Deadeyes confront the nearly unseen foe, announcing their approach with a deluge of grenades and mortar shells. Again, the response is a shower of explosives. In the background, Allied cannons pound away in a steady rhythm, adding percussion to this dance of destruction. To call this an uphill battle painfully understates the scope of the fight. This time, the Yanks achieve and maintain a foothold just short of Kakazu's crest, enduring a steady hail of counterfire. Unable to dig into the coral for cover, Uncle Sam's boys are still at a disadvantage. 2 days of intense counterattack take their toll. By 13 April, the 96th has nothing to show for its 4 days of strife. East of Kakazu, the 7th Division has it only slightly better. Dodging fire from hilltop artillery positions, they advance in fits and starts, pushing 1,000 yards south before stalling outside the hamlet of Uki. Shortages of both manpower and ammunition plague the GIs, who find themselves biding their time in a defensive posture while waiting for fresh artillery and mortar shells. The repercussions from the loss of 2 ammunition ships on 6 April weigh heavily on American commanders. New information about the Rising Sun's defenses on Okinawa raised grave concerns about the resources and staying power of Allied forces. These concerns are allayed somewhat when, under orders from the Japanese second-in-command, General Isamu Cho, the defenders mount a foray into the teeth of the American ranks. Cho has consistently opposed his superior's plan to wear down the Americans. The firebrand senses an opportunity to take matters into his own hands. Following a night infiltration attempt with a morning plunge into the heart of the surprised but unimpressed U.S. forces, Cho's men prove unable to dislodge their adversaries and are soon forced back to their original positions. The GIs may not have gained any ground on the foe, but neither are they giving any away. The Imperial Command's decision to fortify only the southern half of Okinawa means that the north is all but devoid of Japanese activity. The 6th Marines cover the 40 miles from their landing point to the northern tip of the island at Heido-Misaki with ease, leaving only one opposition garrison to the east on the Motobu Peninsula. Once that garrison is eliminated, the Leathernecks will control the upper 3/4 of the island. The harbor facilities they have acquired give them the luxury of receiving supplies by sea, rather than the tortuous overland wagon train suffered by their army brethren to the south. The mixed emotions of the ground forces here receive another jolt when the death of President Roosevelt reaches the Navy ships offshore and quickly spreads to the troops on the island. Roosevelt's army is now, for better or worse, Truman's army. Still sure of their diagnosis, Army General John Hodge and Ground Forces Commander General Simon Buckner conclude that the only sure remedy for the infestation at the bottom of the island is a large injection of ammunition, especially 81mm mortar and 155mm artillery rounds. Beginning on 13 April, 3,000 tons of ordnance come ashore daily, while the guns at the front line deliver Hodge and Buckner's prescription with lethal intensity. Send the enemy a sympathy card. Uncle Sam's scrubbing up for another round of surgery. April 1945, Buchenwald. American tanks tear through barbed wire, revealing a hell on earth. This concentration camp, like the many that dot Eastern Europe, is a monument to the hatred and depravity of Nazi ideals. All the resources and ingenuity of a modern nation have been channeled to the cause of evil. Now the world will know what rancid fruit grows in Hitler's Aryan Garden of Eden. Third Army's slicing drive through southern Germany is in effect dissecting the diseased corpse of the Third Reich. Just 1 week after liberating the death camp at Ohrdruf, General George Patton's troops plunge yet again into the foreboding nightmare of the Holocaust. Buchenwald holds the usual horrors, the walking skeletons, bone dust, and mass graves, but also illustrates the escalating haste of the SS as the Allied snare closes around them. Time has run out on their frantic efforts to move their captives and bury the evidence of their crimes. Some of the 20,000 inmates found at Buchenwald had just been moved to the camp after an arduous journey from the east. Forced to march in the dead of winter, many who started the trip never arrived. Many more died of typhus once they got there. Throughout the camp, emaciated corpses are stacked in piles like cordwood. The sad truth is Buchenwald was not even considered a death camp by the Nazis. And inmates with experience in other camps like Stutthof or Birkenau confirmed the relatively good survival rate here, where thousands upon thousands of Jews, gypsies, and other victims labored at local armament plants, forced at gunpoint to further the cause of Nazism. An average of 200 people died each day, according to the meticulously kept records in the camp's Totenbuch. While there was coal, corpses were burned. When the coal ran out, bodies were thrown in ditches and plowed over. In the final days, victims were simply left to rot in the sun. The gruesome spectacle of such camps inspires nausea even in Patton, who has shown a high tolerance for gore on the battlefield. Of course, battlefields do not produce the kind of calculated crimes in evidence at Buchenwald. Of the many outrages here, the disturbing hobby of the commandant's wife is enough to give pause to even the most callous combatant. Ilse Koch, known as the bitch of Buchenwald, made ornaments and lampshades from human skin, preferably tattooed skin. To the soldiers, the camp was an otherworldly glimpse of suffering and despair. For the prisoners who spent months or years at the edge of the abyss, it is the prospect of freedom that is alien. Some are numb from their experiences, staring impassively at their liberators, as if the GIs were a hallucination. Others manage weak smiles or even salutes. It is soon discovered that these inmates were left behind after yet another grim exodus. There are few Jews among the survivors at Buchenwald. Those who had not been murdered were driven like cattle to Aschersleben and Schönebeck, camps further within the dwindling realm of Nazi control. Even in the face of imminent defeat, the oppressors had clung to their dream of extermination. Escape is not so easy elsewhere. To the north, where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group has thrown the Wehrmacht into a tailspin, the SS has no time to cover its tracks. On 15 April, British tanks blast their way into the concentration camp at Belsen. The camp remains a battleground for 2 days, with British forces claiming its capture and SS guards maintaining partial control. As Allied reinforcements arrive in force, the Brits secure the camp and begin to investigate their horrible prize. Typhus has spread through the camp like wildfire, and the sick had been shut off in their barracks, left to die without even running water. Inmates who had avoided the deadly disease did not fare much better. The commandant had willfully starved some 70,000 people, all clogged into a camp designed for 10,000. Of that number, the British discover 30,000 inmates barely alive, and the dead bodies of 30,000 more. Despite desperate attempts to feed and treat the survivors, the death rate continues to soar after the camp is liberated. British soldiers burn down the disease-infested barracks of the camp. Nazi prisoners are forced to dig graves and tend to the dead. Film and radio reports of the atrocities play to outraged audiences in Britain and America. If anyone had questioned why young men were sent to fight and die on the battlefields of Europe, here is their answer. Other questions, ugly questions about the nature of humanity, defy such easy resolution. The horror of Hitler's crimes hangs like a black cloud over this great world conflict, even as the embers fade in the infamous ovens of genocide. Has carefully nurtured a rivalry between the two commanders, and both want to be the conqueror of the war's greatest prize, Berlin. With a big gun firing for every 13 feet of front, each commander is confident he can keep to his timetable. In conjunction with a third Soviet army group, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, the Soviet army has more than 1.5 million men attacking on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the former border of Czechoslovakia. The job of stopping this juggernaut falls to General Gotthard Heinrizi, commander of Army Group Vistula. But even Heinrizi knows his mission is little more than a fantasy, since his best armor units have been sent to Prague to blunt an imagined Soviet attack there. Nevertheless, dogged resistance from several Vistula units stymies Zhukov's troops along the most direct approach to the German capital. But the massive Soviet freight train of men and material is not to be denied. Konyev's troops wheel north after achieving a breakthrough, and are now 25 miles from extinguishing the candles on Der Führer's birthday cake. After 2 days of fighting, Zhukov's army finally breaks through the defenses on the main passage to Berlin and resumes its advance. German defenders, irreparably shattered, simply have no place left to regroup and put up a coordinated defense. Nazi soldiers stand and die, or hurl themselves pell-mell toward the Western Allies on the Elbe. Very few units are retreating back into Berlin. Hitler has gambled and lost. His delusion that he could steal his armies by the force of his own will to stop the enemy has cost him any chance for an adequate defense of his capital. Now, as Russian artillery begins falling into the city's center, the final curtain begins to fall on this epic 5.5-year tragedy. April 1945, Okinawa. Like Joe Louis in the middle rounds of a title bout, the American Army divisions contesting what has become known as the Shuri Line are looking to land a haymaker that will put the enemy away. The line is actually a series of circles centered in the southern third of Okinawa, at the heart of which lies Shuri Castle. Allied forces continue to punch away at the outer ring, waiting for a strategic slip by the Japanese that will give them a clear shot at the soft interior. For now, however, the castle looms like a heckler in the back row, an unreachable irritant. U.S. Army Commander General John Hodge comes out of his corner on 19 April with some extra muscle when his 27th Division takes a place on the eastern side of the Allied line. To their west are the 96th and 7th Divisions, which have absorbed some body punches from the foe but doggedly hold forth in the center of the ring. The Yanks concentrate heavy barrages of artillery fire on the well-entrenched Japanese, hoping to soften them up for a red, white, and blue knockout punch. But General Mitsuru Ushijima's fighters are no bum-of-the-month club. Written off by their own people and with nothing left to lose, the warriors weather the seemingly endless rain of shells from naval guns, army howitzers, and airborne bombers. If the Americans want Okinawa, they are going to have to shake off their fatigue and slug it out with their adversary. Kakazu Ridge, the focus of the Allies for well over a week, continues to confound Army strategists. Like a block of coral-encrusted Swiss cheese, its imposing expanse hides a network of holes, crevices, and tunnels, each of which must be inspected and secured. It'll take a lot more than a good cut man to fix the damage a hidden sniper can inflict. As the artillery pummeling subsides, the 27th moves into the position where the 96th stalled a week earlier. They discover, to their chagrin, that the enemy still plans on going the distance. The renewed assault on Kakazu is as unproductive as the first. The ground taken by infantry units with satchel charges supported by flame-throwing tanks is relinquished in the face of counter-punches from the reverse slopes of the bloodied hills. Mindful that the beach on the southern end of the island at Minatoga is still a potential landing site, Ushijima is content merely to hold his ground. Ushijima cannot afford to risk a potentially catastrophic change of plans. General Simon Buckner, the leader of the Allied ground effort on Okinawa, has rejected such a landing, unwilling to divide his supply line. From Buckner's newly established onshore command post 2 miles southwest of the Kadena airfield, he tracks both the Army units on the south end of Okinawa and the Marines who are putting to rest the last resistance in the north. The only Japanese fortification of note above the Shuri line is northwest of the island's main landmass on the Motobu Peninsula. There, Colonel Takahito Udo leads a 2,000-man hodgepodge of infantry, Navy troops, and local conscripts against the U.S. 6th Marines. Udo's defense is gritty, but situated atop the Yaidake Hills, it is vulnerable to encirclement. The Americans attack from both sides on the morning of 14 April, but despite superior numbers, they fail to overpower the defenders. The Marines attack repeatedly at close quarters for nearly a week, but Udo's forces are well dug in and lose only a handful of casualties at a time. At last, the action is hand-to-hand, and the ragtag defenders scramble for refuge in the wooded hills. Here, at least, Imperial forces are on the ropes. Offshore, the Yanks find what is left of Hirohito's air force has a glass jaw. A roundhouse combination of carrier-based fighter bombers, B-29s from the Marianas, and escorts flying from Iwo Jima belts the vulnerable airfield at Kyushu hard enough to stagger an already shaky attempt to mount a new kamikaze binge. On 16 April, pilots and flight crews who would ordinarily be bent on disabling Allied vessels find themselves covering up against an explosive uppercut. Many a bewildered airman finds himself seeing stars and stripes. Of the few kamikazes who do get off the ground, most find their trips coming to a premature end, courtesy of Task Force 58's gunnery. The most significant American loss is that of the carrier USS Intrepid, which absorbs a hit severe enough to send it stateside for repairs. Several smaller ships likewise suffer the low blows of the Imperial martyrs, but overall the Navy is merely bruised. Meanwhile, behind the lines on Okinawa, the refugee population swells to over 120,000. Luckily for the Americans, the farmland that dots the island has survived the invasion well, and there is abundant food for the natives without further taxing U.S. supplies. More troubling to the invaders is the question of dispatching the Japanese without causing even more suffering. circumvent the... And should Hitler somehow escape Berlin, there is no bunker in Germany deep enough to protect Himmler from his wrath. Such a miraculous escape, however, is highly unlikely. Red Army tanks are rumbling into the outer limits of the capital, the vanguard of Russian troops, seething with hatred and eager to seize the Germans by the throat. As evidence of their ferocity, hordes of German citizens flee before the Russian invasion, streaming westward by the millions, expecting only death at the hands of their enemy. The American and British forces, led by General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, continue to close in as, one by one, the great cities fall. Stuttgart, Nuremberg, Leipzig. With the Reich literally crumbling around his ears, Hitler's audience has shrunk to a chosen few. The lackluster and irrelevant Eva Braun, along with propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his family, remain by the Fuhrer like cankerous sores. Nero may have fiddled while Rome burned, but Hitler fumes, placing blame on everyone but himself for the unthinkable defeat of the Nazis. Incompetent generals, treacherous subordinates, bungling Italian allies, and miracle weapons whose potential failed to materialize. The end for Hitler is drawing nigh. Will the gathering destruction allow him even a glimpse of the nightmare he has visited upon millions of innocent people? The slain soldiers, murdered Jews, and terrorized populations of this vast war? Or, like all the great cowards and humbugs of history, will he sink down to an ignominious death, unable to realize his own evil legacy? Before the infamy of Pearl Harbor, Japan lived in the American imagination as a mysterious island country set in a sparkling sea. But romantic visions of ancient shrines and graceful controlled by the state, while the newspapers report the actions in Europe with a degree of 20 April 1945, northeastern Italy. The final hours are ticking away for the German divisions trapped south of the Po River near northern Italy's Adriatic coast, and indeed just about everywhere else on the boot. The commander of the German troops in the Po Valley, General Heinrich von Fiedinghoff, orders a retreat to the river's banks in defiance of the demented Hitler's demands that he stand and fight. But crossing the Po itself is difficult. No permanent bridges over the river have existed since July 1944, thanks to an extensive Allied bombing campaign. The only way to cross is by ferry or pontoon boat. But such movement on a large scale is hard to conceal, and that night Allied aerial reconnaissance discovers a hive of enemy activity on the Po. The entire area between Ostiglia and Crespino is filled with pontoon bridges and busy ferries running back and forth between the banks. 3 days of intensive Allied bombing along this stretch of the river brings an immediate halt to the enemy activity and costs the Germans all their equipment. Without the ferries, or any other mode of crossing, they cannot bring their tanks and other materiel with them across the Po. One German commander remarks that the loss of the crossings has finished us. Back on the Po River plains, the 10th Mountain Division races forward, taking so many prisoners that all the Yanks can do is disarm them and send them along to the rear. The retreating Germans scramble along the river's edge and get across any way they can. Some find a ferry still in service 15 miles downriver from the Americans. At dawn on 23 April, the lucky Germans get themselves across. Some skip the ferry and just swim, while the Americans wait hours for their boats. The escapees marched for 2 days, withdrawing north of the Adega River, generally considered the Nazis' last line of defense before Alpine Redoubt. But others remain trapped south of the Po, where they are little more than sitting ducks for the advancing Allied juggernaut. South African troops, for example, kill 100 of the enemy and capture 160 more in the town of Finale Emilia, at a cost of only 2 of their own soldiers killed. Dawn the next morning reveals the Germans have lost still more equipment and supplies. Dozens of cars, trucks, self-propelled guns, artillery, and ammunition litter the surrounding fields. East of Ferrara, the British 78th Division encounters surprisingly tough resistance from the 29th Panzer Grenadiers. The cornered enemy hangs on through 3 hours of close, bitter fighting before the 78th can finish them off. Again, the Germans leave the countryside littered with destroyed tanks, guns, and other equipment. Their manpower problems mount as well, with more than 66,000 casualties, half of whom are now Allied prisoners. The British 8th Army presses on, reaching the banks of the Po on 23 April, the same day the Americans acquire boats to get across. As the Allies ford the Po, the Germans are suddenly beset on new fronts as Italian partisans fight for control of their cities. After Bologna, the partisans capture Genoa on the west coast and are battling it out in Milan and Turin. The Allies are on a roll, clearing the Germans out of Italy. Brazilian units descend from the mountains to try to cut off the Germans, while other American units race to Verona. Elements of the British 8th Army head towards Venice on the east coast. On 25 April, some German commanders start surrendering. There's nowhere left to run. After 3 hard years, the Allies fighting on the forgotten front have brought the Nazis to heel, here at the top of the boot. Immediately began converting the strip for use by Marine bombers. Although their main objective lies nearly 100 miles to the east on the heavily fortified Davao Gulf, the men of the 31st have chosen this route in the hope of striking the unsuspecting Japanese from the rear. They take the optimistically named Highway 1, which turns out to be little more than a cow trail through the center of the island. As the 31st Division drives cautiously toward the rendezvous point, where Highway 1 crosses the Mindanao River, they encounter only wrecked bridges left by the retreating Japanese. They passed through Fort Pickett, already secured by the river troops, and joined their comrades at the Sayre Highway Junction in Kaba Khan as planned. For the first time in their quiet journey, GIs come under scattered fire, but resistance is light and eventually melts away into the jungles. Their rapid advance across the peninsula has divided the retreating Japanese forces and opened the way for a two-pronged attack. General Siebert can afford to split his men, sending one division northward up the Sayre Highway towards Makahalar Bay and the other east to encircle Davao City. In the event the land assault on Davao fails, Siebert still has a division in reserve to assault the fortified beaches at Davao Gulf. Mindanao's terrain is an intimidating mix of mountains, marshland, and rainforest, providing yet another diverse and dicey battlefield for American GIs touring the South Pacific. The Japanese are fighting a losing battle on Mindanao. Though holed up in strong defensive positions, they are pinned into these areas by guerrillas unable to maneuver and often cut off from vital supplies. Now, not only does the enemy face a ground attack by American forces, but Marine bombers are also standing by to pound them from above. Defeat looms before the Japanese like a beckoning ghost, but the way of the warrior is a narrow path. No surrender, no mercy, no other way but death to avoid dishonor. Massive conflict now echo across a wasteland. The end of the war was equally welcome to the airmen who wrought the devastation. There were few jobs more dangerous in the war than keeping these metal crates in the air. If enemy fighters didn't knock them down, then the radar-controlled cannons would get a turn. Just living through a single day was a victory. More than 100,000 of the men who took off from British air bases never made it back. But as bad as the losses were, they could have been much worse had the war dragged on. German technology in the form of jet fighter planes was starting to catch up to the slow-moving bombers. However, the twin-engine Messerschmitt 262 was introduced late in the war, and the limited production capabilities of German industry kept the fighter from obliterating Allied squadrons. Fast as it was, the fighter of the future was not quick enough to save Hitler's dark dream from the dustbin of history. Of course, the destructiveness of the bombing campaign itself was designed to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. A tragic side effect was to create a nation of refugees. The Nazi sabotage of self-preservation in the last months of the war also has left its mark. All across Europe, yesterday's battles have become today's missions of mercy. Perhaps those hardest hit are the long-suffering Dutch, who have been subject to privation on a massive scale. By flooding Holland's farmland, the Germans created an impassable defensive land barrier. They also turned half the country into an island of starvation and suffering. Of the more than 3 million stranded civilians, 15,000 died in the cruel winter of 1945. To stem the tide of death, Allied bombers take to the air again in the first weeks of May. It is one of this conflict's small ironies that the tool of total war should suddenly become an instrument of charity. Bomb bays are loaded with food, and well-used machine guns now are silenced. The silver birds of death swoop down among the church steeples and release their precious cargo to the hungry throngs below. Holland is still occupied, but the guns of the Wehrmacht are silent. The war may not have officially ended, but the armies of the Reich have a new mission: survival. Home to several strategically valuable airfields. This is the place the Japanese were to make their big stand against the Fourth Corps. But a division dispatched to fortify the town never made it, as Burmese tribesmen threw ambush after ambush in their path. A British tank brigade quickly took the city and its airfields, which are to supply vital air cover for an amphibious assault on Rangoon. The assault, Operation Dracula, was designed as an alternative to an overland invasion of the city. Now Dracula has been resurrected as part of a 1-2 punch at Japan's most important possession in Burma. After capturing much of central Burma, Slim's troops are available to provide the land assault. The 26th Indian Division, coming off its capture of Ramree Island, prepares to move into the city with assistance of the Navy's big guns. By the last days of April, the invasion force is aimed at the coast, and Admiral Mountbatten is ready to pull the trigger. What is unclear is whether Slim's men will be in position to take full advantage of Operation Dracula by its launch date. 33rd Corps is more than 100 miles away on the eve of the attack, and 4th Corps meets stiffening resistance as they close in on the city. It looks as if the 4th will make it on time until they hit Pegu, just 50 miles from their destination. The Japanese garrison from Rangoon, rather than waiting to be attacked, has moved up to greet the invaders. So intractable throughout this conflict, the Japanese now seem content to inflict minor damage. After a few days of intense fighting, they blow up the Pegu Bridge and slink away in the night. And so, with the path clear and Rangoon within their grasp, the 4th Corps begins to put down a Bailey Bridge for the final sprint to the coast. It has been an arduous campaign for the 14th Army, and its soldiers are ready for their final prize. But as the advance begins anew, the skies darken. The first drops of rain begin to fall as the clock ticks down on D-Day for Operation Dracula. Monsoon season has begun. The Elbe, two battle-hardened armies faced each other across the river. Soldiers on each side were filled with anxiety, fueled by curiosity, and eager. Tempering their buoyed spirits, however, was the very real possibility that the advancing armies, intent on prying apart the German fatherland, might blunder into one another, setting the stage for a potentially tragic and embarrassing fiasco. Candor has never been a hallmark of relations between and to return at last to the peaceful streets of hometown, USA. Through Europe is geared up the Third Army for its last men depart to rejoin the fray. They soon discover there are more than two sides in the battle for Munich. Will they be going home or to the Pacific? Of clearing hills and highways. The break finally gives the Allies an opening through which they can deploy the remainder of their formidable armor. The 27th follows its accomplishment at Highway 1 by tearing into a thicket of Japanese fortifications called Item Pocket, a crazy quilt of hills, outcroppings, and ravines separating Uncle Sam from the tiny Machinato airstrip to the south. The GI invaders score their biggest gains in close-quarters firefights with their Japanese adversaries, who cling like barnacles to each ridge, defying their attackers to scrape them loose. The efforts of the 27th are mirrored across the Allied front. The Deadeyes of the 96th Division fling themselves at the center of General Mitsuru Ushijima's forces, which dot every available hill, ridge, and outcropping with snipers and machine guns. The Deadeyes struggled at strongly defended Kakazu Ridge, but found weak points at other, more lightly armed emplacements. They wore away at the opposition like an implacable river of humanity, eroding the softest spots and gradually carving their way through the Imperial line. In response, the Japanese conceded Kakazu and its surrounding territory on 24 April, giving the 96th 1,000 yards of clear real estate in which to advance. On the eastern side of the line, the 7th Division lives up to its nickname. As persistent as time itself, the Hourglass Division rains fire, bullets, and artillery on the foe, incurring heavy losses but cashing in on Ushijima's retreat along with the other divisions. Within hours after securing their new offensive perimeter, however, the weary Allies discover that the rising sun is simply elected to rise on a different horizon. The Shuri Line, named for the castle that serves as the Japanese command post deep in the southern end of the island, is not actually a line, but a series of concentric rings. As the defenders' numbers dwindle, the remaining troops fall back to smaller, more tightly packed positions. Manpower has become a problem for both sides. The twin evils of attrition and battle fatigue force Allied ground troops commander General Simon Bolivar Buckner to relieve his dog-tired dog faces. On 30 April, the 1st Marine Division replaces the 27th, bogged down at Item Pocket. The 96th Division gets a well-earned rest with the help of the 77th Division, ready for a new challenge after mopping up stubborn resistance on Yoshima. Buckner calls the American fighting tactic corkscrew and blowtorch. The corkscrew is the barrage of grenades, mortars, and satchel charges directed over the crests of hills and into enemy fortifications. The blowtorch consists of flamethrowers and napalm, flushing resistance from caves and crevices. The Yanks climb each succeeding cliff with ropes, scaling ladders, and even cargo nets, well aware that just beyond the summit of each hill awaits another group of Ushijima's fighters. Once occupied, each hill crest is defended tenaciously. If the GIs are forced to retreat, the trip back down is likely to be much quicker and much more painful. With armor and artillery carpeting enemy positions with support fire, the Americans make slow gains. Indeed, within 36 hours, the only Japanese unit still fighting is an infantry company that has occupied a position behind U.S. lines on the imposing Tonobaro escarpment. They would retreat as well, but they are surrounded and absorbing a small avalanche of red, white, and blue fireworks. Those who have not succumbed to martyrdom by the night of 6 May slip away quietly, ending the ill-fated offensive at a total cost of nearly 5,000 Nipponese. Glumly returning to their defensive positions, the discredited Cho and his brethren settle in for the long, miserable haul. The Japanese have lost something besides manpower and machinery, however. They have lost both composure and hope, and given the Americans a sweet hint of ultimate victory. Its charismatic strongman have finally come to an end. Keeps writing you about that dreamy Eisenhower and the Dallas's grow by the dozen. Your platoon's already tried to take this thing 2 times. Just get past Purple Heart Ridge and this clump of rock and dirt will be property of the U.S. government. Strange what a man thinks before fighting. Your buddy in the 38th Infantry Division, Private Jasper Belk, is fighting General Shitsuo Yokoyama's Shimbu group somewhere over to the west. He claims the fighting there is real hot. You wish he were here right now. Boy, you'd give him hot fighting, all right. The squad forms up. Time for 2nd Squad, 1st Platoon, King Company, 3rd Battalion, and 5th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division to earn its pay. It's just another dirty job in an endless stream of dirty jobs. You've been through it many times before. Nonetheless, you still get that tight feeling in your gut. There's the signal. Off you go, advancing up the hill. Real cautious now. Let's take it slow. There's a whizzing noise. Japanese machine gun. Pour on the fire, guys. Set up that machine gun and let them have it. Holy cow, look at that replacement. Hey, get down if you want to live. And stay close. The firing is heavy, but the guys are still moving up the hill. There's Claude with his BAR, and George has the 30 in position. The other guys are firing their rifles. It looks like the lieutenant has called in some mortar fire for support. Thank God for those 60mm shells. What's that? Down off the hill because the Japanese a personal citation. Now your loafer reputation is all shot to hell. The squad will think you're bucking for sergeant. Walking down the hill, your mouth is bone dry. Even canteen water, normally metallic tasting, quenches the powerful thirst this day. Finally, you've got time for that letter. Glancing at it, you immediately know the news is bad, 'cause it's from someone in Belk's squad. Jasper's done gone and gotten himself killed. No time to fret about it now. Time to go talk to the replacement. After all, he's now part of a unique club. The brotherhood of them what has been shot at. He and the others are over by the radio. You ask the rookie, what day is it? He tells you, Friday, April 20th. Why? Hey, you shout, it's my birthday. reform, he will leave others to deal with the horror he has perpetrated on the world. And they are paying for their mistake. For the British, the bigger risk would have been to wait out the monsoon, needlessly extending the war and sacrificing more lives to an increasingly marginal theater of operations. Thus, Dracula moves forward, with British and American bomber squadrons leading the way. Landing craft hit the beaches and troops pour into the city. The only thing missing is the enemy. The city's residents explain that the Japanese have been gone for days. The remnants of the Emperor's Burma area army are now scattered in the jungles, cut off from supplies, choosing to die of exposure rather than endure the ignominy of surrender. For the Allied conquerors, the recapture of this rugged country is a hollow victory. The citizens of Rangoon, who initially greeted the Japanese as their liberators, now welcome their old landlords back with open arms. But in the course of 3 years, the monolith of British imperialism has started to crack at its foundation. Diplomats now must work feverishly to gather up the shards of their former Asian empire. But will Greater Britannia go back together again? The American mission in Burma was more limited. They simply wanted to keep China in the war, and that goal has been accomplished. Yet, with the war entering its final months, China's usefulness is in doubt. The treacherous supply route from India to China, paved with the blood of American servicemen, has become a fine thoroughfare for Chinese smugglers. Named the Stilwell Road by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in dubious homage to the forthright General Joseph Stilwell, the route is doomed to become so much surplus property at war's end. Although Chinese nationalist troops are still getting supplies, their mainland exploits have been relegated to the back burner of American strategic thought. The Pacific War is all about islands now, and the U.S. Marines are hopscotching their way to Japan. Chiang has lost his place at history's table. The petulant and sometimes perfidious Chinese leader has been difficult to deal with. Just ask Stilwell, whose straight talk ultimately got him yanked from the Generalissimo's inner circle. Chiang's diminished status among the Allies is not his greatest concern, however. As the war winds down, he looks nervously to northwest China and the Great Bend of the Yellow River. Out there, beyond the Great Wall, Mao Zedong's communists wait, biding their time. The architect of the greatest calamity in human history, the last 10 days have brought disappointment, disaster, and death. Adolf Hitler has weathered the betrayals of those closest to him and continues to play the role that his self-shaped destiny has cast for him. This once master of Europe, from the Volga to the English Channel, is now reduced to a Gilbert and Sullivan caricature of himself. Brooding, raving, issuing orders to units that have long ago ceased to exist, Hitler declines to take personal command of those troops willing to fight to save what is left of Germany. Instead, in a last Wagnerian gesture, he marries his mistress, Eva Braun, the crashing of Russian artillery forming their wedding salute. No sooner than the ritual is complete, the city's commander promptly informs Hitler that further resistance can only save him for 24 hours more. Armed with this knowledge, Adolf Hitler, failed Austrian painter, Bavarian corporal, political agitator, chancellor, and Führer of Germany, shuffles off this mortal coil with the assistance of a 9mm pistol and an ampoule of cyanide, his willing wife electing to join him in death. Outside the bunker, the last vestiges of the once proud Wehrmacht die as well. Raw recruits and grizzled veterans are caught between to the steps of his birth. Onward, ever onward, to the Reichstag itself, where the Black Crows of the SS fight more like demons than men until the Soviet banner, planted and unfurled atop the battle-scarred structure, them in their relentless From the very outset of the war, as men have brought arms to bear against one another in a seemingly endless series of battles, a secondary struggle has been carried out both at the front and behind the lines. In this battle, doctors fight to save the lives of the wounded, trying desperately to put back together what technology and hatred have so readily torn apart. Their performance is remarkable. Working under conditions totally in conflict with their task, these men and women perform medical miracles day in and day out. A steady stream of young men who have been injured in combat pours into hospitals where the doctors labor, sometimes in vain, to mend their broken bodies. From here, they are transferred to areas far removed from danger, where they can continue their journey on the road to recovery. But among the men who enter these hospitals, there are those whose bodies are not bleeding or broken, yet whose wounds are as deep and devastating as any the doctors will treat. 2 out of 10 casualties of the war show no outward signs of injury, yet their hurt is as real and painful as those who are carried in on stretchers. The condition goes by many names and manifests itself in many ways, but the simple truth of the matter is that any man exposed to the horrors of war for an extended period of time will reach a breaking point. His mind will no longer tolerate a world filled with violence, agony, terror, and death. In defense of the spirit within, his brain will cease to function as it has in the past. His mind will refuse to respond to the demands of an unbearable reality. Uncontrollable shaking, the inability to speak, fits of anger or tears. The symptoms are many, but the cause is singular: a prolonged exposure to the horror of war. Doctors have developed techniques to help them cope with the fears and anxieties that have disabled them, and, in doing so, alleviate the outward symptoms which have brought them here. A man was knocked unconscious by the blast of a Japanese artillery round had lost all memory of anything prior to that moment in his life. He cannot remember his name, his parents, and his friends. A doctor places him into a state of hypnosis and acts as a guide as he relives his terrifying experience.
Yes, go on. You remember it now. Tell me. It's all right now, but you can tell me. You can tell me. Explosion? Yes. You remember the explosion now. All right, go on.
The doctor injects him with sodium amyl, a drug that produces a state similar to hypnosis. In doing so, the doctor is able to help the patient explore his subconscious, rooting out the cause of his paralysis.
He couldn't walk at all. What do you think of when you can't walk like that?
I wish I could walk.
But what do you think of? What comes to your mind when you find that you can't walk?
So maybe I think our mother and father should be okay. Sometimes I wonder, hope the war ends soon and things like that.
While it is unlikely that they will sort out all that is troubling the young man in a single session, the drug had the added benefit of placing the patient in a highly suggestible state. The doctor is able to replace the notion of paralysis with that of normally functioning legs. Though not fully cured, this soldier has regained the ability to walk, a major step on the road to recovery. These are scenes that are repeated again and again in hospital wards and clinics. Men, their spirits crushed and their minds in revolt, are nursed slowly back to a point where they can rejoin their loved ones and begin to build for themselves a life free from fear and pain. Their battle may not be over. They have been able to put the war behind them and will now try to pick up the pieces and carry on. But if it is true that we are all products of our past, that who we are is determined to a greater or lesser degree by what we have seen or done, then these men, indeed all the men who have served in combat, may never fully put their past behind them. Just as they were undeniably a part of this war, the war may now be inextricably a part of them. Liberated concentration camps and the horrors he beheld there. Regardless, when Dönitz receives word of Eisenhower's intransigence, his dilemma is clear. Sign, or have the entire Western Front closed not only to military personnel, but to German refugees as well. On 7 May, Jodl sends word to Dönitz from Reims that Ike wants the surrender signed before the day is over, with the terms to go into effect in 48 hours. Convinced no better offer is forthcoming, Dönitz authorizes Jodl to accede. Jodl signs documents on 8 May agreeing to Germany's unconditional surrender to all the Allies. Ike instructs him that representatives of the Reich are to present themselves in Berlin the following day to ratify the surrender in front of a Soviet delegation. Thus, on 9 May, with cameras rolling, the chief of the German armed forces, General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, enters the room at the former engineering school at Karlshorst, followed by representatives of both the German Navy and Air Force. Within a few minutes, World War II in Europe is officially over. As word spreads to Wehrmacht units still in the field, local commanders begin to capitulate. Army Group Kurland surrenders to the Russians the next day. On 11 May, the remnants of Army Group Center, which only 3.5 years earlier small units continue to fight to gain the West, they are too weak. Slowly, inevitably, its pulse growing fainter and fainter, that once mighty giant, the Third Reich, dies. Europe stands in the epilogue of a hellstorm of vanity, madness, and murder that began as far back as August 1914. Millions are dead. Millions more are displaced, some undoubtedly forever. The question now is, what next? For the Allies, there is yet an enemy in the Pacific to be defeated. For most Europeans, it is time to collect what remains of their lives and try to rebuild. But for this moment, for soldier and civilian alike, there is one overriding truth that must be savored before the first steps toward a normal life can begin. The war is over. May 1945, near Okinawa. For over a month, the Fifth Fleet has been on constant alert. Tense watches broken only by the terrible ferocity of sudden thunder from the skies. For a brief period after American troops successfully landed at Okinawa on 1st April, and before the fighting assumed its grueling, bloody rhythm of attrition, kamikaze assaults were few. Fast carrier strikes had effectively wiped out enemy air strength in the region in late March, allowing Fifth Fleet Admiral Raymond Spruance ample time to set a defensive shield around the island. There are many names for Japan's suicidal pilots. Americans call them kamikazes, fanatics, or just plain crazy. Sailors aboard America's fighting ships in the Pacific, of course, employ an infinitely more colorful array of pithy epithets for the terrorizing daredevils. But only the Japanese could choose the word kikusui as an appropriate moniker for these death-dealing aircraft. The word means flowering chrysanthemums, a delicate image that does little justice to the actual destructive power of these nose-diving menaces. Enemy pilots breaking from the snarling dogfights overhead seek to light their own funeral pyres on the decks of American ships. Neither the desperation of their methods nor the resilience of their prey deters them. Day after day, more of the brightest flames of Japan's youth are snuffed out in the effort. 16 radar picket stations dispersed around Okinawa attempt to spot enemy aircraft and direct combat air patrol to intercept them. These dangerous outposts, patrolled by destroyers, are primary targets of massed kikusui attacks. The Japanese believe that if they can breach these outer defenses, the Navy vessels supporting and supplying troops of the 10th Army will be the proverbial sitting ducks. Few destroyer crews have stories to rival that of the frenzied Malay over Aaron Ward. In the midst of a sunny afternoon, the crew goes to general quarters when enemy dive bombers are detected. One Japanese pilot comes under fire and veers off to splash abreast of the ship, the violent impact flinging parts of the plane harmlessly onto the deck. Before crewmen can thank their lucky stars for the narrow escape, another plane bears down on them, flaming already from direct hits, and releases a bomb which explodes in a geyser of spraying gasoline and burning debris. While damage control parties work furiously to put out the flames, Aaron Ward's gunners continue to engage enemy planes. Vaporized craft seem to spawn replacements as quickly as they disappear. In murderously rapid succession, 5 kamikaze pilots crash into Aaron Ward, turning it into a maelstrom of raging fires and black smoke. Sailors battle the blaze as ammunition explodes around them. Miraculously, the destroyer survives, but at the cost of almost 100 dead and wounded seamen. Radar picket stations are battered incessantly over the following weeks. In one attack alone, on 11 May, no fewer than 150 enemy planes show up on the radar plots of Hugh Hadley and Evans. Once again, the destroyers are hit by multiple kamikazes, but like punch-drunk prize fighters, reel and come up swinging until the final bell. 5 suiciders crash Evans, and Hugh Hadley trades blows with 10 Zeros at once. All 10 go down, but not without inflicting serious damage. Both ships are visited by the twin plagues of fire and flood as crews race madly to control both. Yank pilots shoot down 50 enemy planes, and the destroyers a combined 27. Some Zeros are literally ridden into the sea by their pursuers who may have run out of ammunition, but not good old Yankee stubbornness. Both ships are towed back to base for repairs and suffer heavy casualties, but the fact that they survived at all attests to the uncommon skill and valor of their crews. It's a tough day at the office throughout the fleet as Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier force receives the signature fiery calling card of the kamikaze. A pilot making a shallow dive crashes into the flight deck of flagship Bunker Hill, and almost immediately afterwards another slams nose into the flag office, killing 3 officers and 11 men on the Admiral's staff. Exploding bombs send fires spreading through fully fueled and armed planes as neighboring destroyers close in to direct their pumps onto the burning hangar deck. Admiral Mitcher is forced to transfer his flag to the Enterprise, unaccompanied by more than 400 of his men, who are either dead or missing, and another 264 wounded. Admiral Spruance is resolved to ride out the kamikaze threat in a naval campaign that is shaping up to be the most costly of the war. Until Okinawa is secured by the 10th Army, the gritty courage of sailors facing the Kikasui attacks will be tested many more times. They have already proven themselves more than equal to the task. The notoriously bloated numbers being cranked out by Japan's propaganda machine would have us believe that the American Navy is teetering on the brink of dissolution. The inherent desperation of kamikaze tactics, however, offers the truer picture of war in the Pacific. Japan's hopes for victory are dying a little more each day, and the flowering chrysanthemums of the Kikasui will form the funeral wreath on a watery grave. troops at the edge of the occupation zone simply detain the fleeing POWs, then hand them over to the Soviets. These desperate men have been doubly cursed. First packed off to the miserable Eastern Front, then made to pay for Hitler's duplicitous attack on Russia. In the final tally, more than 1 million German soldiers fall into Stalin's clutches. The road back to Hausfrau and Hofbrau will not be pleasant if the prisoners made it back at all. Ike will have to disregard requests from Czech forces to come to their aid. That would send American forces well inside the agreed-upon occupation boundaries. To the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's forces actually need to backtrack after chasing the Germans far inside the Soviet zone. These boundaries had earlier been drawn by the British and grudgingly accepted by Roosevelt. Now Stalin is demanding all his promised territory. After finally defeating the war machine of the Third Reich, the Western powers have no wish to incite the wrath of the Russian bear. The Soviets have been bloodied like no other ally, losing some 13.5 million soldiers to the twin threats of Russian winter and German bullets. But the Red Army's ordeal only seems to have made it stronger and more intimidating to the West. The lone voice of dissent is Winston Churchill, who continues to push for Ike's troops to hold their ground, keeping the Russians as far away from Britain as possible. Churchill's own chiefs of staff could not disagree more, and more importantly, neither could Harry Truman. The fledgling president sends a clear message from across the Atlantic. The documents signed at Yalta would be honored. GIs would trade toasts with Soviet comrades in arms, not gunfire. There is plenty of backslapping to go around as the gunfire diminishes and isolated German garrisons begin to surrender. For most GIs, the exultation that they have survived is tempered by the sobering fact that there is still a war going on in the Pacific. Although U.S. forces are sitting on Emperor Hirohito's front porch, the Yanks in Europe know that they are the extra muscle needed to break down the front door. After some well-deserved rest, most will be redeployed. But that is all in the future. Now's the time for the GIs to relax and celebrate. Whatever lies ahead, these men and women can take pride in knowing that they defended freedom when it was most threatened, and in the process, helped vanquish one of mankind's greatest evils. Needless to say, in order to keep peaks often interfered with radio signals. When British troops planned an attack on Colvivecchia in 1943, they expected to face German resistance and ordered American air support to soften up the town before they entered. To their surprise, the enemy had retreated, leaving them on ground scheduled for a U.S. bombing. All attempts at communication failed until little G.I. Joe was sent aloft. Covering 20 treacherous miles, Joe delivered his crucial message just as American bombers were warming up on the runways. 1,000 British troops owed their safety to a Yankee rat with wings. Never the ones to deny credit where it's due, our allies had the Lord Mayor of London decorate G.I. Joe with the Dickon Medal for gallantry. Now, that's a military coup.